Well, my birth date was April 4th, 1920, and I was born at the Barnes home at 415 Avenue A, Opelika, Alabama. Yeah. But you know, at that age and never having experienced it, it didn't mean a whole lot to me. Fortunately, my dad was able to work during the whole time. He was a bank cashier. Well, I applied for the aviation cadet program, knowing that if I didn't, I would more than likely be drafted, because I've been classified 1A. There was a lady on the draft board whose son was a friend of mine, and he was drafted, and she didn't like that one bit. But they eventually called me up in January of 42. I started out in mechanical engineering, and I don't really know why, but for some unknown reason, I changed courses after 2.5 years to aeronautical administration. And unfortunately, anything connected with that was gobbled up by guys who had been, tower control managers and things like that, and they had already been released before I was, so there was really nothing available. I had applied for the aviation cadet program, and I was called in as a cadet at Maxwell Air Force Base. It just didn't work out for me as a pilot, and I graduated from Victorville, California in November of 42 as a bombardier navigator. A friend of mine from Brundage, Alabama, named Fred Burke was in the same class, and he had a nice new Chevy coupe. And fortunately for me, we both were assigned to a squadron flying out of Cherry Point Marine Air Station in North Carolina, flying AT-11s on patrol. The closest I came to getting one was I almost made a drop on a whale. I recognized him just in time. I'd already opened the bomb doors and was ready to let her go. I knew it was going to be a long, drawn-out affair. It certainly was. Let's see, to the summer of, into the summer of 43. And then at that point, we received brand new B-24D models. Remember that, Model D. Mm-hmm. Well, one day while we were patrolling Bay of Biscay, we suddenly encountered 13 German Ju-88s. Now that was probably the Luftwaffe's best all-around twin-engine fighter bomber. And apparently it was a squadron that was on a training flight with one lead instructor with them, because number 13 would circle around and fire a flare, and when he did, one of the 12 would start a frontal attack on us. But just as soon as the nose gunner opened fire with that twin caliber 50 turret. It was a lot more accurate than a single handheld gun. As soon as they saw that fire, they would break off. So after about 3 aborts, the guy with the flares pressed an attack and flew right on over us. And I'm certain we shot him down because the tail gunner saw him in a vertical dive trailing big plume of black smoke. But he got a hit on our wing out between the 3 and 4 engines and knocked out all the controls out in that area. So we couldn't transfer fuel. We couldn't feather the proper number 4 engine, which meant it was just windmilling and creating a tremendous drag. But anyhow, we ducked into a cloud bank and circled around, and in a couple of minutes when we came out, there was no sign of the 12. So we supposed that they beat it back to France, and we struggled to get back to Land's End in Britain. But we made it. Not too long after that incident, the Navy sent a squadron in to relieve us. And we were just sitting there playing poker and drinking whiskey, and somehow it turned out that prior to that time, Winston Churchill, you know who was the Prime Minister, charged the British SOE with doing something to, raise hell for Hitler in occupied Western Europe and Scandinavia in anticipation of the invasion. So all the RAF could do would muster 2 squadrons. And they did a good job, but they just couldn't do enough to really get the job done completely. So they met with our CEO, Colonel Heflin, and it was agreed that we would try to build up a group. After we had been relieved of anti-sub duty by a Navy squadron was when we were approached by the British SOE to try to form a group to work along with the British on these night missions. Churchill, as I told you, had charged the SOE with the responsibility to do something to raise hell for the Hitler in anticipation of the invasion. And they decided that the best way they could do that would be to pump up the French mostly, because they had the biggest and the best resistance forces in service. But the RAF couldn't come up with but 2 squadrons, which is just half of a bomb group. So when they found that we were sitting there with no duty, naturally they figured maybe we could join in. So they came and met with Colonel Heflin, our CO, a couple of other officers. And that's when it was agreed that we would try to form a group, a full group. And if new crews would come into Britain, they'd send them to us. And we would, for their training, one of them would fly in a co-pilot seat with us, our crew, on an actual mission, which was exactly the same thing we had done, only with the RAF. the British, as I said, had created 2 squadrons to fly these kind of missions. And for part of our training, each of our flight officers went to this RAF base and would fly a couple of actual missions with the RAF. The first night I went with a crew flying Halifax bombers into Denmark, and we found the drop site, and somewhat on the ground was flashing a light, but the normal procedure was that that person or persons would flash a letter, pre-assigned letter, to identify themselves. But if they didn't flash the right letter, we didn't drop, because sometimes they had been compromised, and the Germans would try to lure you in, and they just flashed garbled messages and never gave the right signal. So he just started cursing and turned around and flew all the way back over the North Sea to Britain. But that was only nowhere near the worst part of that night. When I got in, the operations officer told me that Jimmy didn't get back. Jimmy Estes was our pilot, and we learned a long time afterwards that the pilot, they were in France, and they could encounter some very thick fog in parts of France. And the pilot tried to let down through some fog and crashed, and only the tail gunner survived. I don't know how that happened, but all I can figure is the tail must have just been cocked up maybe and kind of broke off or something. So I don't think he was even scratched. But we lost Jimmy. Oh, yeah. I mean, you might have a situation where one crewman was down with the flu or something like that, and they pulled somebody from another crew to replace him. Painted a dub, solid black, no markings whatsoever. Took out the twin turret gun out of the nose. Left me sitting in a greenhouse up there with little or no protection, but we didn't need it. I mean, we were flying low level and single aircraft, and really, there was we did lose a few ships to night fighters, but for the most part, it was fairly quiet. The resistance people had little booklets that was sort of like catalogs, and it had a letter or number for any given item that they might ever want or need. And they called to contact the OSS in London, and they would give them these numbers or letters, and they would go to their little catalogs and see what they were. Then there was a base at home, which was a little ways away from our base, where they actually packed the tubes, the containers.
Yeah.
And then they would bring them to the base just shortly before we would go take off, and they would be loaded into bomb bays. So we never had any clue as to what was in them. of course, they had a chute attached, and they had a thick rubber-like pad at the tip to absorb the shock of the landing. The main thing was to get it on the ground and get it out of there as quickly as possible, because they had to provide some lighting, you know, for us to identify them. And there might always be a German patrol somewhere around, who knew. The area where do you know where the belly turret would have been on a B-24?
Sure.
That was removed, and a kind of a tube was fitted into that extended down a foot or two out of the belly of the airplane. It's called the Joe hole. And we had a dispatcher back there with a little light beside him. And I would flick that switch when we were coming over the drop site, and he would kick that Joe out of that hole if he didn't go voluntarily. We don't know. We never even saw them, basically.
So to speak.
They were brought to our base shortly before takeoff, and they were dressed in dull outfits like coveralls, you know, that kind of thing. And you probably couldn't really have told them Joseph or Josephine. But anyhow, it was called the Joe hole. And if they balked, the dispatcher would just give them a push. And of course, their chutes were attached to a static line, so they couldn't mess that up. Then I would drop the containers from about 600 feet. Now, the containers were fitted with lugs that would attach to the bomb racks, just like a 500-pound bomb. And I had a switch in the nose that I could control the doors and the packages, the containers. No, I made 4 missions to Belgium, one to Norway. I just recently got the Norwegian gold medal. And one to Denmark. For example, of the 30 missions that I flew, 18 of them were to France. That on top of the hours that I got flying anti-sub patrol, I had the equivalent of 30 missions. So Colonel Heflin, our CO, called me in and advised me that I did, and that I could have a choice of staying in the squadron or the group and coming back to the States. So I figured I had pressed my luck quite a bit, you know. What with the anti-sub thing and getting shot at a few times at night, and just in general, you know, it was kind of rough going. So I came home and was assigned to Liberal Army Airfield, Liberal, Kansas. Every time they have a dust storm out there, you'd have that much dust on your bed when you got back. The only good thing about it was we were allowed to go cross-country flights as part of the training mission. I'll never forget the one, they had a snowstorm coming in, and we took off for Palm Springs. Made it there, made a clean landing. The next day we walked out and looked up, and there was a mountain right beside it. We hadn't missed it by very much. But I finally was allowed to retire from active duty after that. And of course, the war was won by then. I remember Roosevelt's passing, and we stood in water that deep on the tarmac at attention for a while. When I was retired from active duty, the sergeant who processed my papers said, "Sir, you know that you were commissioned in the reserves?" And I said, "Well, I hadn't really thought about it." And so he advised me and said that I would have the privilege of remaining in the reserves if I wanted to, even of active duty. So I did, and I was able to amass enough points and grades to retire from active duty, and with the rank of lieutenant colonel and base privileges, that kind of thing. Pretty nice. Well, I'll tell you, as the sole surviving member of the squadron that formed the nucleus of the Carpetbagger project, to my knowledge, I am the only one surviving at this point. Now, most of the fellows in that squadron had been in for a while when I joined them. So they were several years older. But I remember my wife and I were at a football game at Crampton Bowl one night after the war. And I happened to glance back about 3 rows behind me, and there was Colonel Heflin. I guess he was at the commanding staff's school there, at Maxwell. So we had a nice get-together, he and his wife, Pat. But as I said, at this point, as far as I know, I'm the only surviving member of that squadron. Now, of course, we built up enough personnel to form a group, but they were all newcomers, and younger. I don't know how many of them stayed in. Oh, I'll have to tell you, speaking of that, I'll have to tell you about Johnny Meade. Johnny Meade was a classmate of mine at Victorville. We got to be real good friends, and I think he was from Jacksonville, but he had moved to New Orleans. He, I guess, volunteered to fly with another crew one night. And they just were incredibly unlucky. They flew over a flat train and got shot down. Well, the hit set a fuel line on fire or something, and they couldn't extinguish the fire, and it was just getting worse, so they were ordered to bail out. Well, I said, "Well, Johnny, what did you do then?" He said, "Well, I buried my parachute and I took off." There was a little pathway, and I found that and followed it. He said, I broke out of the woods just about daybreak, and I looked out and I saw this little French girl coming along. So I said, "Well, what did you do then, Johnny?" And he said, "Well, when she finally got up to where I was, I got up the nerve to step out and try to introduce myself as an American. And she motioned to him to follow her, which he did. And shortly they came to a little farm building, and she pointed toward that for him to enter it. Oh, he did, and he said he'd no sooner gotten inside when he heard a latch click and a door lock. He said, excuse me, damn, here I've survived a bailout and managed to avoid the Germans all night, only to be duped by a little French girl. I said, well, Johnny, what did you do then? He said, well, I just looked around and I saw a stack of jugs, and they were full of wine. So I just opened one and drank it. But in a little while, the father came out and took him inside the house, and they held him there for a little while and finally got him in touch with the British French resistance, Maquis. And he stayed over there with them for, I don't know, maybe a couple of weeks, and went on a couple of raids with them, that kind of thing. And finally, Colonel Heflin, the CO, flew a C-47 into the area and picked him up and flew him back to Britain. So, good ending. I went back to Belgium some years after the war, visited with my dear friend Rene Londos, who became our group representative in Belgium. And he told me that he wanted to enlist in the resistance before he was 16 years old, but his father told him to go talk with the priest, which he did, and he persuaded him to wait until he was 16 to join. But he did, and one of our crews was shot down one night by a German night fighter over Belgium, and Rene located 3 or 4 of them and took them in and hid them up in the attic of a building somewhere. They were not caught. Eventually got out. But Rene, years later, located that German pilot. Now, how, I don't know, but he did. And invited him to come and meet these fellows that had been in the plane that he shot down. And he came, and he said that at the beginning of the war, he was just a student, and he was taking flying lessons. So they just hauled him in and made him a pilot. But he said that he didn't attempt to kill anybody. He just got behind the aircraft and quietly shot out an engine and gave him ample opportunity to bail out. We got out and got in the airplane and took off and got out over the channel, and instead of going on in around Caen, pilot turned due south between Jersey and Guernsey. And he said, why are we going this way? And nobody even responded to him at all, just sat there. The chief's asking, we don't usually go this way. Why are we going like this? Well, that went on, and finally we struck land way further south and found the drop site, and I made the drop and came back out the same route. By that time, the flannel was the, what do you call it?
The channel.
Huh?
The channel?
They were in the channel. invaders.
So you could see them by then?
Yeah. He finally realized what was going on then when he saw that fleet out there. He came to the base with her, but you know, he was rather elusive. But we were called out and lined up, you know, and she walked down our ranks and shook hands with each one of us, asked us how we were doing and what we thought about England, and you know, just old routine. But she didn't rush it at all. But he just stood over to the side with Colonel Heflin and waited for her to do all the work. I think it made me a little more appreciative of values, you know, and I came right out of college, I guess, because there were others who were younger than me, but actually in that squadron that I joined, they all were somewhat older, which was a good thing.